Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at the French model of 1866 Chassepot needle rifle. I'm publishing this in conjunction with the pre-sale of my book on French military rifles, Chassepot to FAMAS, so we'll talk about that at the end. But if you're interested in French rifles, that is the excellent book to get. So, back to this particular example. The Chassepot was one of only a couple of needle fire rifles that were actually put into major mainstream use by continental European militaries. The other main one being the Dreyse system. Now, the Dreyse system was developed and used by Prussia, and it originated in the 1840s, so predates this by, well, actually 25 years, so quite substantially. The Dreyse was the first of its type, and it was really a rifle ahead of its time. Now, by the time the 1860s roll around, breech-loading firearms have are clearly the wave of the future, and a lot of different countries are looking at adopting breech loaders or converting muzzle loaders into breech loaders. It is so much faster and more efficient to load the cartridge or load your projectile and powder from the back rather than have to try and pour powder down the barrel, set a projectile in the barrel, ram it all the way down. That system is slow and, well, pretty much slow, and gives you a real tendency to fumble and mess it up. And so any opportunity to have a breech-loading firearm is going to be much better. This really comes into public recognition, or military recognition, after the Austrians and the Prussians go to war in the 1860s, and the Austrians have muzzle-loading rifles, and the Prussians have their Dreyse needle-fire breech-loading rifles. And in particular, every time infantry units come face-to-face in that war, the Prussians just kick the pants out of the Austrians. And it is one of only really a very limited number of situations where infantry rifle technology has a really dramatic impact on the outcome of an overall war. Those Dreyse needle-fire rifles were massively superior to the Austrian muzzleloaders. And so everyone sat up and took notice, and the French among them. Now, the French military had been investigating breech-loading arms since like the 1850s, in particular for cavalry use. Cavalry have always had this problem of, well, you're riding on a horse. You know, it's a little finicky to try and muzzle-load a rifle on the ground. Imagine you're trying to do it being jostled around on horseback, holding the reins with one hand and trying to fumble around with powder and ball and a ramrod. For this reason, cavalry in many places were actually still armed with like a brace of preloaded pistols and a sword or a lance, because it was really quite difficult for them to load a rifle on horseback. And so that's the first area where the French were intending to equip or to come up with a breech-loading rifle. But they never ended up doing it. They investigated a lot, they made small batch production of a few things, but they were kind of indecisive about this. And it wasn't until this defeat of Austria by Prussia that they realized, wow, we really need to just get moving and pick something and adopt it, and we need to do it for our entire military, not just the cavalry. And so that's what led to the adoption of the Chassepot. This was designed by a gentleman by the name of Antoine Chassepot, predictably. And this is actually like the fourth version of the rifle that he put together. His initial versions, the two prior to this one were 1858 and 1862. Those were actually in some ways more advanced rifles, although in some ways not. They actually had dual rear locking lugs on the bolt, but they were still percussion fired. So they used a paper cartridge with a separate percussion cap. And early in the 1860s, kind of late in the development process of this guy, Napoleon III actually specified that the new rifle had to be needle fire. So why not a metallic cartridge? Well, metallic cartridges were clearly better, but they were a lot harder to manufacture. The technology for making a reliable and relatively inexpensive brass cartridge hadn't been developed yet. And so there was concern that if we adopt a brass case firing rifle, well, we're going to have serious logistical problems supplying the ammunition. Whereas a paper cartridge is very easy to produce. Troops can produce that in the field if they need to. It's easy to supply powder and ball. We're used to that. We can make paper cartridges, no big deal. And so Chassepot redesigned his rifle to use the needle fire system because it now wouldn't be percussion cap fired. The rear end of the bolt had to be redesigned, and he ended up getting rid of the two opposed locking lugs and replacing them with kind of a more archaic system of just using the stem of the bolt handle as a single large locking lug. That was perfectly acceptable for the black powder pressures that this rifle generates, and so that's what they ended up going with. Production began in 1867, and it would ultimately run until 1875, although there would be a big interruption in the middle in 1870 when France went to war with Prussia themselves. So, before we talk about the outcome of that war, let's go ahead and take a little bit of a closer look at this, both how it works and the differences between early and late versions of the Chassepot. First off, I'll show you some of the external features. There are basically two patterns of Chassepot. There are early and late production ones, and they have a number of small changes, small differences, but we'll go through them. They'll allow you to identify what is right and wrong on a Chassepot. All right, so first off, we have some receiver markings. We have model 1866 here on the back, and then we'll have the marking of the factory that produced the gun. So Chassepots were made by all four major French arsenals, as well as some private contractors. And what we have here is indicative of an early production gun. So you can see it says Manufacture Imperial. This is manufactured under the French Second Empire, which ended with the defeat of the French armies in the Franco-Prussian War. So these are going to be guns 1870 and earlier. This particular one was made at Mutzig, which is interesting in that it's an arsenal that was actually in land that was taken by Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. So Mutzig only produced rifles up to the Chassepot, and after 1871, or after 1870, you do not find any French production from that arsenal. So kind of cool to have an example here of Mutzig. After the end of the war, this would change, and it would become Manufactured des Armes. They got rid of the Imperial label, and this is manufactured under the French Third Republic, which was the government that came next. Now, this particular one is made by Saint-Étienne. There would also be ones made by Tulle and made by Châtellerault. Note that this still is a model 1866. There are a few intermediate varieties, kind of rare variations that we'll take a look at more in my book. I don't have examples of them here to show you. However, I can show you this guy. This is marked Cahen-Lion SC, so Cahen-Lion and Company, and this is a French company that was subcontracted to manufacture Chassepots as well. There was a need to re-equip the entire French military with these when they were adopted. By the time the Franco-Prussian War started, they had made about 1.2 million of them, and they did several 100,000 more after the war before the adoption of, well, before these were replaced. What's interesting about Cahen-Lion is that they didn't actually make any guns. They subcontracted this out to a whole bunch of other companies, and they were international companies. So this particular one was manufactured by a company in Belgium, Liège there, but Cahen-Lion Chassepots were made in, in Belgium, in England, in Spain, in Italy, literally all over Europe. The serial numbers on Chassepots will have a letter prefix and then a 5-digit or up to 5-digit serial number. The letters were allocated out to the different manufacturing concerns. So Cahen-Lion, as a private subcontractor, was given the U and V prefixes. Châtellerault got A, B, and C. Mutzig here got D and E. And by the way, for later guns, D and E would be given to Châtellerault after the Mutzig factory shut down. And then Saint-Étienne got most of the rest. They got F, G, H. They skipped I. They got J, K, L, M, N. They skipped O, and then they gave P and Q to Saint-Étienne. So this is a Q. R, S, and T were allocated to the Tulle arsenal. On the other side of the barrel, you'll have a letter indicating the arsenal that created the barrel, which is generally going to be the same as the receiver, and the date of production. So this is an 1873 late production gun, where the Mutzig here with the M is an 1868 production. And lastly, you'll find a really cool stamp on the stock, or usually, if the stock's been replaced, this will be gone, and often these are worn or sanded down and hard to read. So it's cool to have an intact one like this. This will have the month and the year of military acceptance of the rifle. So we can identify that this was accepted right down to September, specifically, of 1873. There is this center plug marked MA, that's Manufactured des Armes, same thing that's marked on the receiver. For the early Imperial guns, that will be marked MI for Manufacture Imperial. And then there are some indicators on here of the the guys who are in control of the factory and the inspection process when this rifle, or when any of these rifles, were specifically inspected and approved. By the way, that center plug is a either boxwood or dogwood plug, and it is there to indicate military ownership of the rifle, because there's really no way to get rid of it. If you can't sand it over, you can't just get rid of it because it'll be obvious that you've patched that hole. And if you want to steal this rifle from military stores and have it or sell it on the private market, you're going to have to completely replace the stock. And the idea was to make that expensive enough to be a hindrance or a way to help prevent theft of military arms. Despite being a needle fire rifle, the Chassepot really kind of feels like one of the more modern bolt-action rifles. In comparison to the Dreyse kind of handles like a muzzleloader. It certainly doesn't shoot like one, but just the manual of arms and the style of things like the trigger guard and the stock on the Dreyse feel a bit older. They feel previous generation, where the Chassepot really does have the handling characteristics of a modern rifle, certainly for the 1860s. It's got what we would recognize today as a very traditional standard bolt-action system, but in the 1860s, that wasn't exactly common. This was on the cutting edge of breech-loading rifles at the time. So we've got that, but with one major exception, and that is we have a cocking piece here, but once you fire, cocking piece drops, of course, what we normally expect is that you then lift the bolt handle and that recocks the action. On the Chassepot, it does not. On the Chassepot, you actually have to manually recock the thing before you can open the bolt. Now, there was good reason for that. The way this works is, well, needle fire. So let me pull the bolt out and show you. In order to do this, we need to remove this screw. You don't actually have to remove it. You just have to loosen it because it holds the bolt in place. So now that we have the bolt out, all right, so the way that this all works is you have a paper cartridge, bullet in front, powder behind it, all wrapped up in paper, and then there's a primer, basically a percussion cap, that is on the inside of the paper cartridge right at the base. And in order to fire, the firing literal needle of the gun, which when I drop the bolt like it was fired, you can see that needle protruding through, this actually has to penetrate into the paper cartridge and hit that primer that's inside. Now on the Dreyse, that primer was located in the base of the bullet, which means the Dreyse needle had to go quite a substantial distance into the cartridge. On the Chassepot, they moved that primer to the base of the whole cartridge at the very bottom, so the needle didn't have to go very far in. However, it did have to puncture into the cartridge. And the reason that you have to manually recock the gun is if you had a failure to fire, there was a chance that when you pulled the needle out of the cartridge, the friction of it rubbing against the percussion cap, the primer in there, would actually set it off. And so what they wanted to prevent was any chance of the cartridge being set off when the bolt was open and the gun was unlocked, because that would be substantially bad. That's an out of battery detonation and you want to avoid it. So the way to avoid that is force you to recock the action first while the bolt is still locked. Then if the cartridge does go off, well, hopefully you're pointing the gun in a safe direction, but at least it's not going to blow out the back of the action. So that's why they made that change. All right, I'm going to switch over to our older style bolt here because it still has this rubber obturator. So the way this works is you have this long stalk that actually pushes the paper cartridge in, and you've got an airspace back here behind the cartridge. Now today, you will see people very concerned about making sure that there's not airspace in reloaded cartridges. However, we have a bit of a different situation here because the powder in a Chassepot cartridge is all contained in that paper cartridge, and so it's not loose. You don't have airspace within the powder. Instead, you have this airspace around here behind the cartridge, and that was an important and very deliberate technological element of the design from Antoine Chassepot. The reason is this creates a combustion chamber behind the cartridge which will function to blow that paper cartridge out the muzzle behind the bullet, so you don't have leftover bits of paper cartridge stuck in the chamber that are going to prevent you from loading the next cartridge in behind it. So that was deliberate, and it was effective, and it was actually really quite an intelligent addition to the design. Now, the way this actually works, when you fire, you're going to create, of course, a lot of pressure in the chamber, and that is going to push backwards on this metal plate. as you can see on this one, that metal plate can move forward and back. In between, what stops it from moving back is this black rubber obturator. And when the disc presses back, now this one's old and hardened because it's like 150 years old now, this will expand concentrically out here, and it will cause the back end of the chamber to actually seal against gas. And that's called obturation, and that's how this system actually worked. Now I can take that off by removing this screw. Again, I don't actually have to remove it, I just have to loosen it. And then we can pull out the front section here, the obturator. There we go. So there's your rubber obturator disc. It's kind of cool. You can actually get reproductions of these as well as modern reproduction needles. So these are completely fireable today if you want to put in the effort to make your own cartridges. So beyond that, we have a spring here on the inside and our needle. With the Chassepots cleaning kit came a little wrench with two flats that allowed you to unscrew this. This one's all really tight down and I don't have the wrench at hand. So this allowed you to remove the front end of the bolt and replace the needle if you needed to. My understanding is needles last about 200 rounds, give or take. Soldiers were actually issued with replacement spare needles. That was a consumable part, both the needle and the obturator. They're both exposed to high pressure, very hot combustion gas, and they do wear out over time. So I mentioned there were a few differences between early and late examples of the Chassepot. Let's take a quick look at those. This is our early Imperial production one, and it has a rather narrow rear tang. They widened that on later production guns to reduce the chance of cracking the stock behind the tang. They also changed the style of the cocking piece. You can see a little bit of it here. It's more evident at the back, however, you can see the different design style here. This doesn't seem to have done much mechanically. It was just kind of a design change and probably simplified the manufacturing process. These rifles proved to be effective enough at long range that they would actually, in later production, lengthen the sights. So the original sight here goes out to 1,200 meters. You do that, of course, by standing the sight up and running this slider all the way up to the top. That goes to 12. On the later version, they would take this and they would add a second slider that takes it out to 1,700 meters. So substantially longer than that guy. I should also point out that this is the full-length infantry rifle version of the Chassepot. The French did manufacture 3 different types of carbines, or rather 2 carbines and a musketoon, a very short artillery musketoon, and then 2 carbines of equal barrel length, one for cavalry and mounted gendarmerie, and one for gendarmerie on foot. So those are quite scarce. We'll cover those in a separate video, and we'll also talk about those when we talk about the replacement for the Chassepot, because a lot of the Chassepot carbines, in fact, the majority of the Chassepot carbines were converted into Gras carbines later on. One last thing I want to point out, of course, we have a bayonet lug on the front. We'll get into bayonet separately. This video's gone long enough as it is. Cleaning rods on the Chassepot are actually numbered to match the gun. And you'll notice that there's no slot on here for a cleaning patch. Now, of course, for cleaning, you would wrap cloth around there or use a pull through. But one of the important purposes of this rod was not just cleaning the gun, but pushing out a cartridge that failed to fire. Because these were firing paper cartridges, there is no rim, there is no extractor mechanism in the bolt. And if you chambered one of those things, and for whatever reason you had a bad primer and it failed to fire, you had to have a way to get it out of the gun, and that had to be done from the front. And that's why there is a clearing rod that has a nice big flat front on it to push on the bullet, to make sure that you don't just like jam the bullet down through the cartridge and really get yourself in a sticky spot, but rather to allow you to cleanly push out the whole cartridge out the back if it fails to fire. So if you know only a little bit about the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871, what you know is probably that the French lost it pretty badly. What's interesting though, however, is that this was a loss of tactics and artillery, and the Chassepot actually really proved its worth on the modern battlefield in this war. This far outranged the Dreyse needle fire rifles. Obviously it was far superior to muzzleloaders, but when infantry units of the Prussians and the French came head to head, Just as the Prussians had defeated the Austrians pretty soundly, French infantry soundly defeated Prussian infantry using the Chassepot rifle. This had an effective range of legitimately 1,200 yards, which was, well, 1,200 meters, sorry, which was far in excess of what the Dreyse could do. The Chassepot has a smaller diameter bullet, it's much higher velocity. It is a bullet that engages directly into the rifling, unlike the Dreyse, which had a paper sabot around the bullet and a much lower muzzle velocity. This was a very effective infantry rifle. Problem was, for the French, their overall tactics and their artillery were a serious letdown that led to their defeat. Interestingly, also led to the Prussian capture of massive numbers of Chassepot rifles. You know, they surrounded whole French armies and captured them, and they got their guns at the same time. Interestingly, the German cavalry didn't have any really good cavalry carbines at this point, and this is right about when they're going to adopt the Mauser 1871, but it would take several years before the carbine version of the 1871 was actually available for use. And so for a substantial period of time after 1871, pretty much all the German states would use captured Chassepot rifles and carbines for their own cavalry. Some of those were, well, they were cut down to various different lengths. Some of them were left in the original paper cartridge of the Chassepot. Some of them were converted to metallic cartridge, the 11mm Mauser. The different German states each kind of had their own thing that they were doing with those. But it's a really interesting, like, after note to the Chassepot that these ended up being a standard German cavalry rifle as well, which does help to highlight how good of a gun they really were. Now, the Chassepot would actually stay in production until 1875. The French military wanted, of course, to re-equip itself after the disaster of the Franco-Prussian War. Ultimately, what they would do is redesign the Chassepot to use a metallic cartridge, and that would be in 1874, and it would be designated the Gras rifle. So we'll cover the Gras in a later video, but I thought, I've done a video on the Chassepot before, but I think I had the opportunity to do a far better one today, so show you a lot more information. And if you would like more information than what we've gone through in this video, in addition to some really cool pictures, tables, tabular data, and all sorts of cool stuff on the Chassepot and every major French rifle that followed it up to 2016, what you should do is pre-order a copy of my book. It's over there. Chassepot de FAMAS, French Military Rifles, 1866 to 2016. We are running the Kickstarter pre-order for the book all through this month, and there are some really cool Kickstarter-only options that are available just for people who are pre-ordering the book. I'm really excited about it. I think it turned out really, really well, and I think you'll really enjoy it too if you have any interest in the subject of French military rifles. So check it out. There's a link to the Kickstarter in the description text below. And well, if you're not interested in French rifles, not a problem. Not a big problem. It's a little problem. But stick around and we'll have something cool and different for you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.